The morning of July 30th, 1943, 20 miles west of Cape Finisterre, in the Bay of Biscay, Flight Lieutenant Dudley Marrows sat in the pilot's seat of his short Sunderland flying boat, the 4 Pegasus engines thrumming in steady rhythm as he maintained altitude at 1,500 feet. Through the spray-flecked windscreen, the Atlantic stretched grey and restless beneath broken cloud. Then, at 10:47 hours, the radar operator's voice crackled through the intercom. Contact. Surface vessels. Multiple returns. Marrows banked the Sunderland toward the coordinates. Within minutes, he could see them with the naked eye, 3 dark shapes on the water, moving in formation. U-boats. On the surface. In daylight. All 3. It made no sense. For 2 years, German submarine commanders had learned the hard lessons of the Bay of Biscay. Aircraft ruled these waters now. The doctrine was simple, burned into every U-boat crew through bitter experience. Transit submerged during the day, surface only at night to charge batteries. Yet here were 3 boats, brazenly exposed, their anti-aircraft guns already swinging toward the approaching Sunderland. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. As Marrows circled at 1,200 feet, more aircraft converged on the scene. The U-boats U-461, U-462, and U-504 held their formation, a floating fortress of coordinated firepower. Their quadruple 20mm cannons and 37mm guns tracked the circling aircraft, waiting. This was the new tactic. Admiral Donitz's answer to the aerial slaughter that had turned the Bay of Biscay into what U-boat crews now called the Valley of Death. Fight on the surface. Meet the aircraft with concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Cross the bay in groups for mutual defense. Marrows understood the tactical calculation immediately. The U-boats could maneuver faster than his lumbering Sunderland could line up an attack run. If he came in alone, those guns would tear his aircraft apart before he reached release altitude for his depth charges. He radioed for support and continued circling, keeping the submarines in sight. More aircraft arrived, a Liberator, a Halifax, then a Catalina. By early afternoon, 5 aircraft orbited the 3 U-boats, and Royal Navy sloops were racing to the scene. The submarines maintained their formation, guns elevated, ready. Captain Wolf Stiebler, commanding the senior boat, recalled the moment with crystalline clarity. It wasn't long before several planes were above us. Our defense with the quadruple guns worked very well. But Marrows had seen the fatal flaw. When multiple aircraft attacked from different angles, the quadruple cannons could track only one threat. He waited until a second Sunderland positioned itself opposite his bearing, then pushed the throttles forward and began his descent. The sea rushed up. Tracers arced past the cockpit. The Sunderland's own guns hammered back. At 50 feet above the wavetops, 50 feet, low enough to see the expressions on the faces of the German gunners, Marrows held steady. The aircraft shuddered. The bombardier released. 6 depth charges, each containing 290 pounds of Torpex explosive, fell away in a stick, their cylindrical forms tumbling toward the water. Marrows pulled up hard, the Sunderland clawing for altitude. Behind him, the depth charges entered the water in a tight pattern. The pistols, preset to 25 feet, counted down the seconds as the charges sank. 25 feet. For a surfaced U-boat, 25 feet meant the charges would detonate directly beneath the pressure hull, in the killing zone where the explosive force could crack the steel plating like an eggshell. U-461 began to settle almost immediately. To understand why this moment mattered, why Marrows and thousands of Allied airmen were flying at wave-top height against German submarines in the summer of 1943, requires stepping back to the early days of the war, when the certainties of pre-war doctrine met the realities of the Atlantic battle. When war began in September 1939, RAF Coastal Command possessed 298 aircraft, of which only 171 were operational. Their primary anti-submarine weapon was the 100-pound anti-submarine bomb, which required a direct hit to inflict any damage, an almost impossible feat against a maneuvering submarine. The command was known within the RAF as the Cinderella Service, starved of resources, while Fighter Command and Bomber Command received priority for men, machines, and innovation. The U-boats, meanwhile, operated according to a well-established pattern. During daylight, they ran submerged, invisible to searching aircraft. At night, they surfaced to charge batteries and make passage on diesel engines, confident that darkness provided effective protection. A Type 7 U-boat could crash dive in approximately 30 seconds, disappearing beneath the waves before most aircraft could complete an attack run. This calculus began shifting in 1941 and 42, slowly at first. The Mark 7 airborne depth charge entered service, a 450-pound weapon adapted from Royal Navy designs, fitted with streamlined nose fairings and tail fins. It carried 290 pounds of Amatol explosive, capable of splitting a submarine's pressure hull at a distance of 20 feet. When the filling changed to Torpex in late 1942, that lethal radius increased to 26 feet. But the depth charges of early 1942 came with severe limitations. The Mark 8 variant could not be safely released above 150 feet altitude or at speeds exceeding 150 knots. Drop a depth charge too high or too fast, and it would tumble unpredictably or break apart on water impact. This meant pilots had to bring their aircraft down to near suicidal altitudes, flying straight and level through whatever anti-aircraft fire the submarines could muster, just to deliver their weapons accurately. The Germans adapted. U-boat commanders increased their anti-aircraft armament. Single machine guns became twin mounts, then quadruple installations. 20mm cannons appeared, then 37mm guns. Some boats bristled with enough firepower to challenge light surface vessels. Coastal Command aircraft losses mounted. Then, in June 1942, came the Lee Light, a 2 million candle power searchlight mounted in the ventral turret of modified Wellington bombers. Working in concert with the Mark II air-to-surface vessel radar, the Lee Light transformed night operations. Radar would detect a surfaced U-boat at several miles range. The aircraft would home in blind until approximately 1 mile from target, then illuminate the submarine with the searchlight at the critical moment for attack. U-boat command's response was immediate. If aircraft could now attack at night, submarines would transit submerged at night and surface during the day, relying on Luftwaffe fighter cover over the Bay of Biscay. But the Luftwaffe, committed to the Eastern Front and the defense of German cities, could provide only intermittent patrols. The bay remained what Air Marshal John Slessor called the trunk of the Atlantic U-boat menace, the choke point where submarines had to pass between their bases at Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and La Rochelle and their operational areas in the Atlantic. By early 1943, Allied aircraft equipped with improved radar and the new Torpex-filled depth charges, preset to detonate at 25 feet, had created a killing ground. Between February and August 1943, Coastal Command sank 26 U-boats in the bay. German submariners began calling it the Todezone. The transformation that brought Marrows to that moment over U-461 involved more than new weapons and radar. It required a fundamental reimagining of how aircraft could kill submarines, a shift built on mathematics, operational analysis, and the willingness of crews to fly at altitudes that erased the margin for error. The critical breakthrough came from scientific advisors like E.J. Williams, who applied statistical analysis to anti-submarine operations. Williams attended meetings of the Cabinet Anti-U-Boat Committee at 10 Downing Street, presenting data that contradicted conventional assumptions. The evidence showed that increasing the number of depth charges dropped in an attack mattered less than the spacing between them and the depth at which they detonated. A tight pattern of charges detonating at the precise depth where a submarine sat offered far higher probability of a kill than scattered attacks with larger weapon loads. This analysis pointed toward a paradox. The most effective attacks occurred not when aircraft approached from high altitude with time to line up carefully, but when they came in low and fast, releasing their weapons in a concentrated stick before the submarine could maneuver or crash dive. But low-level attacks required pilots to maintain precise altitude, while flying through defensive fire 50 feet above the wave tops, low enough that a momentary distraction or turbulence could put the aircraft into the water. The depth-charge pistols themselves underwent refinement. The Mark III shallow-depth pistol, introduced in 1942, could be preset to detonate at 25 feet. For a surfaced or crash-diving submarine, this setting placed the explosion directly beneath the pressure hull, where the hydraulic shock effect would be most devastating. The Torpex filling, containing 40% more explosive power than Amatol, meant that a single depth charge detonating within 15 to 20 feet of a U-boat's hull could crack it open. Pilots learned to read the water. A surfaced U-boat left a wake pattern. A crash-diving boat disturbed the surface in characteristic ways, the swirl of water rushing into ballast tanks, the oil sheen sometimes released as submarines went deep. Good pilots could estimate a submarine's position seconds after it disappeared, calculating where it would be by the time their depth charges reached detonation depth. At 50 feet of altitude, flying at 120 knots, these calculations had to be instantaneous and instinctive. The tactical evolution accelerated through 1943, when single aircraft proved vulnerable to concentrated U-boat anti-aircraft fire. Coastal Command developed cooperative tactics. Multiple aircraft would orbit a sighted submarine, forcing the boat to divide its defensive attention. One aircraft would draw fire, while another attacked from a different bearing. Surface ships joined the hunt when available, creating combined operations that gave submarines no avenue of escape. Training intensified at bases along England's southwestern coast. Crews practiced low-level navigation over the Atlantic swells, learning to judge altitude without instruments in poor visibility. Bombardiers drilled on release timing, understanding that a half-second hesitation could mean the difference between a killing pattern and a near miss. Gunners learned to return fire at point-blank range, suppressing U-boat anti-aircraft positions during the final seconds of an attack run. By summer 1943, the pieces had converged. Consolidated Liberators and short Sunderlands, equipped with Mark III centimetric radar that U-boats could not detect, prowled the bay in strength. The Mark VIII Torpex depth charge, with its shallow-depth pistol, provided the killing weapon. Cooperative tactics negated U-boat attempts at mutual defense. And most important, crews had internalized the brutal arithmetic of low-altitude attacks that flying at 50 feet, under fire, with no margin for error, was simply what the mission required. This was the operational reality that Donitz confronted when his U-boats entered the Bay of Bisque. Cross the transit zone in groups, fight on the surface. Bring concentrated anti-aircraft fire against the hunting aircraft. These were reasonable tactical adaptations. They were also, as the summer of 1943 would demonstrate, utterly insufficient. The weapon that made low-level attacks possible existed because of restrictions that seemed, at first glance, to make it impossible. The Mark VIII depth charge, as modified for aircraft use in 1941, weighed 450 pounds fully loaded. Inside its cylindrical steel casing sat 290 pounds of Amatol, later replaced with Torpex, a mixture of RDX, TNT, and aluminum powder that delivered 42% more explosive force than TNT alone. The hydrostatic pistol, mounted in a 6-inch tube running through the charge's center, could be preset using a brass key to expose different-sized flooding holes. Water pressure would compress a rubber bellows, cocking the firing pin at the selected depth. But the Mark VIII had been designed for the Royal Navy's purposes, dropped from surface ships travelling at known speeds, entering the water at predictable angles. When Coastal Command adapted it for aerial use, they discovered immediate problems. The charge's ballistics were unstable. Dropped from high altitude or at excessive speed, it would tumble through the air, strike the water at unpredictable angles, and either break apart or sink far from the intended impact point. Test after test at the RAF's weapons proving grounds demonstrated that reliable delivery required strict parameters: maximum altitude of 150 feet, maximum airspeed of 150 knots. Violate either constraint, and the weapon became effectively useless. 150 feet. In practical terms, this meant pilots had to descend to an altitude where they could clearly distinguish individual whitecaps on the wave tops. At that height, atmospheric turbulence from the sea surface buffeted aircraft constantly. A Sunderland or Liberator, weighing 30,000 pounds or more, would rise and fall unpredictably in the disturbed air. Maintaining precisely 150 feet required constant attention to the altimeter and visual references, work that had to continue even as anti-aircraft fire converged on the attacking aircraft. 150 knots. This airspeed put most Coastal Command aircraft near their minimum controllable speed at low altitude. The Sunderland, in particular, flew at barely 20 knots above its stalling speed when throttled back to 150 knots with landing flaps deployed. Pilots learned to carry slightly more speed on the approach, then bleed it off in the final seconds before release. Too fast, and the depth charges would scatter. Too slow, and the aircraft would stall, plunging into the sea before the crew could recover. The bombardiers, the crew members responsible for releasing the depth charges, worked within even tighter constraints. They sighted through a Mark III angular velocity bombsight, a mechanical computing device that accounted for the aircraft's speed, altitude, and the depth charge's ballistic characteristics. But at 150 feet, the bombsight's calculations had to be instantaneous. From visual acquisition of the target to weapon release was typically 12 to 15 seconds. Subtract time for final approach corrections, and the bombardier had perhaps 5 seconds to confirm target position, wind drift, and release timing. Training records from No. 19 Group, responsible for Bay of Biscay operations, show that crews typically required 20 to 30 practice attacks before achieving consistent accuracy at low level. The training occurred over small boats towing targets in the waters off Cornwall and Devon. Crews would make repeated runs, releasing smoke markers instead of live weapons, while observers in the target boats recorded impact points. A pattern placing all 6 markers within 60 feet of the target, the spacing that operational analysis indicated would bracket a U-boat effectively qualified as successful. The human cost of this training appears in the casualty reports. Between January and August 1943, Coastal Command lost 14 aircraft in training accidents related to low-level operations. Most crashed into the sea during practice attacks. Some struck the water during approach. Others stalled at low altitude while trying to maintain the precise airspeed required for accurate delivery. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The moment that revealed Donitz's miscalculation came not from a single engagement, but from the accumulated weight of July 1943's operations. On July 30th, the same day Marrows sank U-461, 2 other U-boats in that surface group went down as well. U-462 and U-504, despite their concentrated anti-aircraft fire, could not prevent multiple coordinated attacks. Royal Navy sloops finished what the aircraft had begun. 3 boats, 3 crews, 153 men lost in a single afternoon. The tactical concept had seemed sound in conference rooms at U-boat headquarters. German analysis of Bay of Biscay attacks through early 1943 showed that single aircraft achieved kills in only 7% of engagements. When U-boats travelled in groups and fought on the surface, that percentage should theoretically decrease further. Concentrated fire from 6 or 8, anti-aircraft guns ought to destroy or drive off attacking aircraft before they could complete their runs. Multiple submarines meant multiple spotters, earlier warnings, no possibility of surprise. But the analysis had failed to account for Allied operational adaptation. Coastal Command did not send single aircraft against U-boat groups. The standing order, issued by Air Marshal Slessor in June, specified that any crew sighting multiple submarines should immediately call for support and orbit out of engagement range until at least 2 other aircraft arrived. The radio traffic from those July engagements shows crews following this doctrine precisely. First sighting at 10:47 hours. Call for support at 10:50 hours. Additional aircraft on station by 11:15. Attack commencing at 12:30, with 5 aircraft and surface vessels in coordinated assault. The disparity in resources became brutally clear. In July 1943, No. 19 Group flew 4,327 sorties over the Bay of Biscay. They lost 11 aircraft, a loss rate of 0.25%. German submarine losses in the same period: 11 boats sunk by air attack, 17 more damaged sufficiently to abort their patrols. Every U-boat attempting to transit the bay that month was attacked an average of 1.3 times. Some faced 5 or 6 separate engagements. On August 2nd, Donitz summoned his senior commanders to a conference at U-boat headquarters in Paris. The meeting minutes, recovered after the war, record his assessment with stark clarity. The U-boat's new Matox radar detection receivers, which had provided warning against the earlier Mark II radar, were worthless against the Allies' centimetric Mark III sets. Aircraft were detecting submarines before the boat's new aircraft were present. The attempt to fight through the bay on the surface had failed. In Donitz's own words, recorded by his operations officer, "The enemy has rendered the U-boat ineffective. We must conserve the boats we have." The order that followed marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. U-boats would henceforth transit the bay submerged, day and night, surfacing only when absolutely necessary to charge batteries. Patrol durations would extend, as submarines spent more time underwater. Operational ranges would decrease, as battery charging consumed time previously used for transit. The fundamental calculus of U-boat warfare, the boat's ability to use the ocean's vastness as protection, had been overturned. In the Bay of Biscay, the July slaughter demonstrated what operational analysis had predicted. Aircraft flying at 50 to 150 feet, attacking in coordinated groups, dropping Torpex charges preset to 25 feet depth, achieved kill rates approaching 20% per attack. When surface ships joined the engagement, that rate increased to 35%. The Valley of Death had earned its name not through dramatic individual victories, but through the relentless mathematics of attrition. 3 U-boats sunk on July 30th, 2 more on August 1st, 4 on August 2nd. The pattern continued through the month. By August 15th, when the last German boats retreated from the bay, 26 submarines had been destroyed in waters where, 18 months earlier, they had operated with near impunity. The crews who flew these missions understood what the tactical manuals and operational orders could not fully convey, that the decision to fly at wave-top height represented a fundamental rejection of self-preservation instinct. Flight Lieutenant Allen, captain of a No. 59 Squadron Liberator, described the experience in his post-mission report from July 19, 1943. At 50 feet, you see everything: the faces of men on the conning tower, the water they're standing in as the boat takes seas over the bow, the muzzle flashes from their guns. You understand, at that moment, that there is no altitude to spare, no speed to trade for safety, no margin whatsoever. You're committed. The psychological preparation for this kind of flying began during training, but training could only approximate the reality. Squadron records show that crews typically completed 15 to 20 low-level practice attacks before being certified for operational missions. Those practice runs occurred in daylight, over calm water, with no hostile fire. The actual missions took place in North Atlantic weather-broken cloud, rain squalls, visibility measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles. And U-boat crews, once they accepted they were fighting for survival, fired with desperate accuracy. Flight Sergeant W. Anderson's crew experienced the reality on June 29, 1943, when they encountered 3 U-boats traveling in V formation south of Brest. Anderson's after-action report describes the approach: heavy cannon fire from all 3 boats, direct hits on port wing and fuselage. Number 2, engine struck, losing oil pressure. Continued attack run, released 6 depth charges from 100 feet altitude, port wing now burning, broke off attack and proceeded to base on 3 engines. Anderson's Liberator made it home. 13 others did not return from Bay of Biscay operations that month. The bomber crew's men, trained to operate at 10,000 feet or higher, found themselves in a kind of warfare for which no prior experience had prepared them. The skill set required for successful low-level anti-submarine attacks bore almost no relation to conventional bombing doctrine. Visual target acquisition, instantaneous altitude judgment, steady nerves under direct fire at point-blank range, these became the essential capabilities. Some crews adapted naturally, others struggled. The squadron medical officer's reports from 1943 document the psychological strain. Flight. Crews exhibited what the medical staff termed operational exhaustion. Insomnia, loss of appetite, inability to concentrate between missions. Modern understanding would classify this as combat stress reaction. The treatment at the time consisted of brief stand-downs from operational flying, then return to duty. Crews that could not continue were reassigned to training duties or ground positions. No stigma attached to these reassignments. The operational tempo simply required that frontline crews maintain psychological capacity to continue low-level attacks. The U-boat crews faced their own psychological disintegration. The war diary of U-boats based at Lorient records declining morale through July and August 1943. Boats that had previously completed patrols lasting 6 to 8 weeks now limped back after 3 or 4, reporting critical damage from air attack. Some submarines never reported at all posted as missing, last known position somewhere in the Bay transit zone. The commanders who did return described an environment of constant threat, where surfacing for even a few hours to charge batteries invited almost immediate air attack. Kapitän-Leutnant Herbert Werner, commanding U-415, wrote after the war of his July passage through the bay, "We knew the aircraft were there. We could hear them on hydrophones, circling above. Every time we surfaced, we counted seconds until we had to crash dive again. By the 4th day, my crew was near breaking. We had spent 96 hours submerged, the air foul, the batteries depleted. When we finally reached open Atlantic, we had consumed 17 days just to cross the bay. Our war patrol was over before it began." Flight Lieutenant Dudley Marrows landed his Sunderland at Plymouth at 16:20 hours on July 30th, 1943. The debrief lasted 90 minutes. Intelligence officers recorded the attack geometry, the depth charge spacing, the observed results. U-461 confirmed sunk. U-462 and U-504 destroyed by follow-on attacks. 3 submarines, 3 crews, 153 men gone in the span of 5 hours. Marrows flew again 48 hours later. This was the operational tempo. No stand-down for successful missions. No celebration. The Bay of Biscay remained full of U-boats, and every sortie offered the possibility of contact. Between August 1st and August 15th, Marrows and his crew flew 11 more patrols. They sighted submarines on 4 occasions. They attacked twice more. They sank nothing else that month, but their presence, the presence of hundreds of aircraft like theirs, achieved what individual kills could not. The U-boats retreated. By August 20th, Admiral Donitz had withdrawn his boats from surface transit altogether. The official order, distributed to all commanders in the Atlantic theatre, reversed 2 years of doctrine. All submarines would cross the bay submerged, surfacing only in emergencies. The decision effectively cut operational patrol duration by 1/3, as boats consumed their battery endurance simply reaching their patrol zones. A Type 7 submarine that previously could sustain 8 weeks at sea now returned after 5 or 6, having spent the equivalent of 2 weeks crawling submerged through waters that should have taken 4 days to cross. The immediate operational impact cascaded through the entire U-boat campaign. In June 1943, German submarines in the Atlantic sank 17 Allied merchant ships, totaling 86,000 tons. In July, as the Bay slaughter reached its peak, sinkings dropped to 11 ships, 46,000 tons. In August, despite more U-boats theoretically available for operations, only 4 merchant ships went down 17,000 tons total. The curve had inverted. More submarines, fewer kills. The mathematics of attrition had turned against the hunters. For the Allied air crews, There was no sense of decisive victory. The missions continued. The weather remained brutal. The bay remained dangerous. But the pattern had shifted unmistakably. Sighting reports decreased week by week. The U-boats that did surface scattered and dove at the first hint of aircraft presence. The surface groups vanished entirely. By September, crews flying bay patrols often completed their entire 6-hour sorties without seeing a single submarine. The absence of contact became its own form of success. Marrows himself flew through December 1943, completing 83 operational sorties over the bay. He survived the war, retired as a wing commander, and died in 1986, aged 72. His memoir, published posthumously, contains a single paragraph about July 30th. He describes the attack clinically, notes the confirmed kill, mentions the follow-on engagements. Then this: "We understood we were part of something larger, not heroes, not individuals making history. Just one crew, one aircraft, one day in a campaign that required 10,000 such days to win." The U-boat we sank that morning was replaced within weeks. But the pattern we established, the tactics, the coordination, the relentless pressure, could not be countered. That was the victory, not the single kill. The system. The system prevailed because men like Marrows flew at wave-top height, day after day, through weather that should have grounded them, into fire that should have destroyed them, until the enemy's will to continue fractured under the accumulated weight of loss. The Battle of the Bay of Biscay occupies no prominent place in popular memory of World War II. There were no iconic photographs, no dramatic battles witnessed by millions, no singular moment when the outcome crystallized into public consciousness. The victory emerged from spreadsheets, sortie counts, contact reports, kill ratios, tonnage sunk versus submarines destroyed. Yet the strategic consequences rippled through the entire Atlantic campaign and fundamentally altered the trajectory of the war. The numbers tell the story. In the 6 months preceding July 1943, January through June, German submarines in the Atlantic sank 270 Allied merchant ships, totaling 1.4 million tons. The convoys still got through, but the losses remained strategically significant. Britain's import stockpiles continued declining. The build-up of American forces in England proceeded more slowly than planned. Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, remained constrained by shipping availability. In the 6 months following August 1943 through January 1944, German submarines sank 61 Allied merchant ships, totaling 280,000 tons. The collapse was total. The U-boat force, which had numbered over 400 operational boats at its peak, could no longer sustain effective pressure on Allied supply lines. Not because the submarines ceased to exist, but because they could not reach their operational areas with sufficient endurance to conduct effective patrols. The Bay of Biscay campaign had achieved what the Admiralty termed strategic quarantine. German submarines still operated, still sank ships, still threatened individual convoys, but they could no longer operate in sufficient numbers, with sufficient coordination, to threaten the Allied logistics system as a whole. The margin of safety had shifted. Convoy escorts could focus on active defense rather than desperate protection. Air patrols could range farther, cover more area, respond to contacts with multiple aircraft rather than single desperate attacks. This strategic shift enabled everything that followed. Operation Overlord required 7,000 vessels to transport 150,000 men across the Channel on D-Day, with another million to follow in the weeks after. The logistics of that operation demanded secure Atlantic supply lines. Food, fuel, ammunition, vehicles, replacement personnel, all had to cross 3,000 miles of ocean without catastrophic loss. The invasion plan assumed that U-boats would sink perhaps 2% of shipping. The actual loss rate, June through August 1944, measured 0.4%. The difference between those numbers was the Battle of the Bay of Biscay. The Germans understood what had happened. Donitz's war diary from September 1943 contains this assessment. The enemy's air forces have made the bay impassable by day and dangerous by night. Our boats now require 2 weeks to reach operational areas that previously took 4 days. This delay reduces patrol effectiveness by 40% and increases crew exhaustion to levels incompatible with sustained combat operations. The conclusion is unavoidable. We have lost the bay, and with it, access to the Atlantic convoy routes under conditions that permit effective attack. The technical solutions the Germans attempted came too late. The Schnorchel breathing apparatus, which allowed submerged diesel operation, reached operational boats only in early 1944. Type XXI submarines with high underwater speed and endurance began trials in late 1944, but never deployed operationally in significant numbers. The Type 7 boats that had formed the backbone of the U-boat force became increasingly obsolete, their surface speed advantage negated by the requirement to remain submerged. The human cost of this transformation appears starkly in German casualty records. Of the approximately 39,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, 28,000 died a casualty rate of 72%. Many of these losses occurred after August 1943, as submarines with reduced operational capability continued deploying against Allied forces with overwhelming superiority. The Bay of Biscay had demonstrated that aircraft could kill submarines systematically. The lesson, once learned, applied everywhere. U-boats operated. This is the truth that emerges from the archives, from the operational records, from the casualty lists. The Second World War was won not only in the dramatic moments, the beaches of Normandy, the skies over Britain, the ruins of Berlin, but in 1,000 smaller victories like the one Flight Lieutenant Marrows achieved on July 30th, 1943. 1 submarine sunk, 3 depth charges placed correctly, 50 feet of altitude maintained while guns fired and men died, a single day's work in a campaign that required 10,000 such days. The Bay of Biscay remembers. The grey waters that claimed 153 German submariners on that July afternoon, the waves that continued rolling, indifferent to the transformation occurring beneath their surface. The same ocean that witnessed the beginning of the U-boat war witnessed its effective end, not with surrender, but with retreat, not with drama, but with mathematics, not with a single decisive battle, but with the accumulated weight of loss that made further resistance futile. In the end, the cost of truth was measured in courage, the courage to fly low, to press attacks home, to return day after day into the same deadly waters. And the truth itself? That wars are won not by those who avoid risk, but by those who accept necessary sacrifice in service of larger purpose. Flight Lieutenant Marrows and his generation understood this. They flew at 50 feet because that's what victory required. They survived or died according to the cruel mathematics of combat. And in surviving or dying, they secured the outcome that allowed the world to continue. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.